England's really different from a lot of the rest of Europe in terms of absolutism and things like that, since they're going to have a really strong parliamentary system that really limits the amount of power that a monarch can have. Uh, so for a long time in England, there's been a struggle between the monarchs and Parliament, and mostly this has been done over money. Queen Elizabeth I of England had constant conflicts with Parliament because she kept asking them for money, and often the Parliament or the government didn't have the money to help pay Elizabeth's debts. So when James I took over after Elizabeth's death, he actually inherits a lot of Elizabeth's debt issues. And so he also struggles with Parliament over money. And in addition, Parliament's controlled by Puritans, which is kind of a sect off of the Calvinists, right? And so James I is a Protestant, but he is not a Puritan, and he actually offends some of those in Parliament. Charles I, who was his son, James I's son, also fights with Parliament over money. And eventually he gets so upset with Parliament that he actually dissolves Parliament several times, which means that he kind of abolishes the institution of parliamentary decision making. And so he kind of strikes out on his own across England. But in order to fight a war against the Scots, he actually has to call Parliament again in order to get money that he needs. So in order to get this money, Charles had to sign something called the Petition of Right that the Parliament made. And this pretty much set the first limits on monarch's powers. And what the Petition of Right said is that he couldn't imprison someone without due cause, he couldn't raise new taxes without Parliament's consent, and there would be no martial law during peacetime. And so this is your first kind of limiting factor on monarchs in England at this time period. So Charles doesn't like this, obviously, very much, and he offends Parliament, so he doesn't give in to any of the Puritan concessions or any of the Puritan demands, and he tries to force the Scots to be Anglican, and they rebel, and so he needs money to fight the Scots. He calls Parliament. Parliament says, no, we're going to try to limit your power, and Charles tries to arrest some of the Parliament leaders. And it's at this point that there's kind of no reconciliation that can be had. So Charles actually flees to the north of the country where he has support. And this is the beginning of the Civil War. So you have on one side, you have the royalists who are obviously supporting Charles I and his Protestant ways. And then they're also called the Cavaliers. And then you also have the Roundheads, who are kind of the parliamentary supporters. And so they begin fighting. At the beginning, it's a stalemate, but eventually the Roundheads found a good leader in Oliver Cromwell, who was a great military general and could lead to victory. So eventually Cromwell captures the kings and brings them to trial. And Charles I is charged with treason and is found guilty and was sentenced to death. And this is kind of a revolutionary thing at this time period because never had a king been put on public trial and then executed. So in Europe in general, not just in England. So this was a big deal at the time. So Cromwell takes over afterwards and he establishes a military dictatorship. He abolishes the monarchy. He establishes a republic with a constitution, which is the first constitution in Europe. But he doesn't really abide by that constitution and kind of tears it up anyway and just kind of becomes a military ruler. He fought the Irish and crushed their uprising and also upset the Irish by taking their homes and giving it to his English generals and English army men. Anyway, the Puritans of Cromwell tried to reform society, tried to make it more strict, tried to abolish the sinful activities. There was no more theater or going out dancing or anything along those lines. And this lasted a while until Cromwell actually dies. And so Parliament decides, most of England itself is pretty tired of having a military dictatorship, and so they decide to reestablish a monarchy. So Charles II is restored to the monarchy, and this was Charles I's son. And anyway, Parliament passes something called habeas corpus, which gives the people the rights to have rights within the justice system. And it's a discussion of, there is a discussion of who should inherit the throne, maybe James II, who is a Catholic, and this is the development of the first political parties at this time, is that the Whigs opposed hiring James or appointing James as the monarch, and the Tories supported it. And these will eventually be kind of the precursors of the first political parties in England. So once in power, James II kind of flaunted his Catholicism. People didn't like that. Parliament protested, and eventually James dissolved it. James did have a son, and a lot of people in England were really fearful of the fact that he was Catholic, and they were scared that maybe James II's son would continue the Catholic reign or monarchy line. And so James had a sister, Mary, who was the Queen of the Netherlands, and her husband was William of Orange. And so they were actually invited by parliamentary members and members of English society to come over and take over the English throne. And so they did. So William of Orange landed his army, James fled, and this is what's known as the Glorious Revolution. No one died during this process, and the Protestant king came and replaced the Catholic king, and everybody's happy ever after. However, in order to take over the government, William had to sign the Bill of Rights, which was created in 1689. And so this is kind of your first, or I guess your second real limit on the power of the absolute monarch can have. So the Bill of Rights of 1689 said that you're no longer allowed to suspend, the monarch was no longer allowed to suspend Parliament's laws. They couldn't tax without Parliament's permission. There's freedom of speech in Parliament, and there shouldn't be any penalty for any grievances that are brought up against the monarch. So this is kind of your first constitution written and accepted in Western Europe, and eventually there will be a cabinet that is developed that will help kind of move the monarch from being a central part of the government to more of a figurehead.